On this episode of Clinically Pressed, we sit down with AJ, Dr. Jagum, who is one of the founders and co-hosts of Clinically Pressed, and our frequent flyer guest, Andy Asco, who is currently working on his PhD at the University of Illinois. In this episode, we talk about alcohol and athletes and really kind of cover a broad range of what alcohol can do to an athlete or just the general person who's trying to increase their fitness. There's a lot of cons in alcohol with athletics, just in terms of what it can do to your body and your performance. But we also touch on some of the potential benefits when everything's used in moderation and in different times and specific instances. So a lot to be covered. Very interesting episode. We hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here's the episode. Welcome to this episode of Clinically Pressed. We are on with AJ and Andy, two long-term staples on the podcast. And today, AJ and I have been talking about this for a while, but we are talking about alcohol and athletics and really trying to focus on the whole spectrum of how that relates. First off, kind of looking at how it can be detrimental to performance and recovery and the different things there. And we'll let AJ and Andy get into the science of all of that with protein and everything along there. But then also talking about it that we're not trying to necessarily make it like just the anti of everything when it comes to alcohol. As recently seen, if you hadn't, and go check out Andy's Instagram, you can still perform at a relatively high level while potentially under some said influence of alcohol. So really, we're just going to kind of cover all the bases, provide some really interesting things, probably some take-homes. I know for me, I'm looking forward to this because it's something in working with college athletes. You try and educate them on, you understand it's part of college, it's part of what they're going to do, but the more you can educate and try and maybe mitigate some of those things, hopefully you get a little bit better results in the long run. So first off, I think we want to kind of get into like basically what effects does alcohol have on the body?
Yeah, and kind of before we get into that, I would think an important part of that is kind of setting the stage of really what we're talking about. And usually I think a lot of the research kind of is focused on this kind of timing window of what happens after a game or an intense bout of training or exercise session. If you then go and ingest alcohol, what is it doing to how your body would normally respond to that, again, intense game or training session? So there's, I'd say, some literature out there, not a lot. It is a bit of a challenging kind of area to do research in because there's a lot of, I guess, limitations and barriers when you're providing alcohol to subjects. It gets pretty tricky in terms of how you're monitoring the safety. What are they doing after they drink? Is you go send them out on town? Are you bringing them back the next day? It makes sure that you regulate how much they slept, ate, all those things. So it is a pretty tricky area of research to do, but there is a handful of studies that have looked at kind of that post-exercise recovery period. And unfortunately, as you said, it's not a great picture in terms of how acute alcohol ingestion can impact a number of different kind of physiological responses, looking at kind of protein synthesis or our muscles' ability to kind of start the repair and recovery process, from an immune response standpoint, hormonal response standpoint, even getting into sleep and quality of sleep. Pretty much you could go down the line and every one of those processes is hindered in some way with alcohol ingestion, and it kind of seems to operate in a dose response manner. The more alcohol you consume, the bigger of a reduction you'll see in protein synthesis response or reduction in testosterone levels, bigger disruptions in sleep. So you kind of name it. You can pretty much just go down the line of whatever you need from a recovery standpoint. To some degree, it's being hindered by alcohol ingestion. So in a perfect world, you just wouldn't do it because it's not going to make you a better athlete. But the reality of the situation is people are still going to do it. It's very much ingrained in society, especially in the sporting culture. It's kind of natural to go out and celebrate after a big win and go out with friends and definitely partake in some of those festivities. So it happens, and it's important not to ignore that. But more so, how can we kind of combine what we know about the science behind it in terms of more practical recommendations? So if you are going to do it, what are some things that you can do proactively to potentially minimize some of those kind of detrimental effects? So that's kind of how I usually set that stage and kind of provide context to that discussion.
Research out there. I know you just said how it's really hard to obviously conduct it, and you mentioned the dose response. Have you seen, like, is it a certain level potentially that where things drastically shift? Like we were talking about just off the episode of, I talked with an athlete that I worked with that maybe just hurt their ankle or whatever during a game on a Saturday and whatnot, or, they're just basically beat up, and talk to them about, there's a difference between having a six-pack with your buddies and then not remembering the night. And just in terms of what that's going to do to your body. Have you seen anything out there in terms of like potential numbers of drinks, or is it like a certain like blood alcohol level? Again, that's really broad, but I don't know if there's anything that you've seen or even have either of you a general idea of if there's a line, if there's better recommendations to be made, if that's going to be part of it.
Yeah, I'm sure there kind of is. I don't really have that at my fingertips. A lot of the studies, I would say, usually do a pretty good job of investigating, I don't want to say a reasonable amount, but a practical amount that's, I guess,
more
relevant.
effective dose.
Yeah, so like there's a handful of rugby studies, where they've given guys alcohol post-match, and the amount that they give is pretty, I don't even know. That could be a can of worms depending on what kind of rugby player you hang out with, but they like to have a good time and drink a fair amount. And the amount that they're usually providing is, again, kind of relevant to how people would actually drink post-match. But in terms of what that actual amount is, I don't have that at my fingertips of where they do kind of see maybe that threshold where things really start to go downhill quickly. They usually, of course, science has always got to present things in such a weird way. So the amounts that they're mentioning, it's not like they say 7 beers. It's some type of relative amount of grams of
Grams
ethanol
per kilo.
Yeah, per kilogram body weight. So, which is good to do. You want it relative to body size and everything so you can replicate that. But it's, again, not as just easy as saying, no, this one looked at 3 beers, this one looked at 6, 9, and 12 beers. They don't quite do it that way.
Thoughts, Andy?
So I'm not immediately familiar with that body of research so much, but just speculatively, I would assume the reasonable scientist or coach would, if you're going to do it, the minimum amount that you're willing to drink. I would imagine that there's no real safe dose of ethanol that's going to not have an effect or have. I don't imagine it's like this compounding effect once you get more and more intoxicated. But like I said, that's my best estimate based on knowledge of physiology and kind of how things work. Yeah.
And I think once you start even getting above, like the legal limit, if we even use kind of a driving scenario where if you're blowing a blood alcohol level above, 0.08, 0.1, you're probably getting close to that point where going above that's going to have a much bigger kind of negative impact than if you're staying below that. Because if you are, that means you're probably having 1 to 3 drinks per hour, depending on if you're a bigger person or not. And that allows you to kind of stay within that level. And that means you're kind of metabolizing it almost as fast as you're consuming it. And so that could be one kind of just general recommendation if you want to think about it that way. Whereas if you're blowing a 0.24, you've clearly been out at wristband night and putting them down quite a bit to get to that level, and there's no way you're waking up feeling great the next day.
So maybe we can get into maybe a little bit more of the science around like the protein synthesis. I wish I would have written it down. Dr. Wright went through a full spectrum of this with some of our athletes as we were gearing up for the spring semester in terms of how it affects the different protein synthesis channels and whatnot. But I remember at a talk I was at when I was an undergrad, and I don't have the science to back this up, but I've kind of used it ever since, is a night of binge drinking could potentially erase, or obviously going to have a significant impact on any of like the adaptations that your body may have made over the last like 7 to 10 days. And again, you guys are much more into the physiology, Andy, specifically around protein, from what I've gathered in some of our other conversations. Thoughts on that, or just your general comments on alcohol's effect in terms of protein synthesis, general muscle function, this beyond the obvious of that if you're drunk, your muscles probably don't function quite as well in most circumstances, unless you can still pull over 700 pounds doing it. But any thoughts on that?
Whew. Yeah, a lot to unpack there in that one.
Sorry.
I think sometimes the easiest way to describe it, and I'll be curious to get your view on this too, but you can just think of any kind of intense training session. Like let's say football has an afternoon lift at 3:30 or 4, and it's a pretty intense strength session. Normally in that scenario, that session is going to kind of flip a lot of those switches, a lot of those kind of regulatory mechanisms on that would kind of upregulate protein synthesis in that kind of post-training type of window. And if you can kind of complement that with protein and amino acids, you're definitely maximizing that potential for muscle growth and improved recovery and training adaptations. But what happens is if you throw alcohol into the mix, you're kind of turning that signal down a little bit so that you don't set yourself up for that same type of normal response and adaptation kind of to that response. So if you just do it once, it probably won't be a huge hindrance. But if you're doing that Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, and you throw in a couple other sessions or even a game on like a Saturday night, again, each time you're doing that, you're reducing that signal that normally your body could have benefited from, and kind of just benefit from that adaptive response, I guess. I don't know, Andy, if you have anything more on the specific ones. I again don't have a lot of that data at my fingertips on which, to what degree. I think it's usually about 15 to 20% reduction in protein synthesis rates is usually what they've seen, at least out of kind of that North Texas group that does some of that.
Yeah. So the paper that comes to mind, I haven't dug into this literature deep by any means, but just by virtue of Stu being on the paper and then Luis Burke's on the paper, Vernon Coffey, I think John Hawley was the corresponding on it. They gave a pretty hefty dose of ethanol. I want to say it was like the equivalent of like 10 drinks immediately post-exercise. And then they did biopsies for Western blotting and protein synthesis rates. And they found, alcohol combined with either carbohydrate or protein didn't, I think protein was higher than alcohol combined with carbohydrates. Like protein and alcohol was higher than protein and carbohydrate, whereas protein without the alcohol was still obviously higher. I'm trying to remember. I think there was downregulated mTOR signaling. And one thing, if I'm correct, there was also a decrease in peak essential amino acids in the plasma. So it could be, and likely is, a multifaceted approach whereby alcohol both affects absorption and digestion of nutrients, So you have less of that substrate to signal the muscle. And then again, in the muscle, you have this impaired metabolic function, which affects the phosphoproteome. So we're not getting all these molecular signals that lead to the assembly of translational machinery, where then we have proteins being spit out. And over time, like kind of what AJ was saying, I think we're not in the practical yet, but I think practically speaking, it's like anything like diet training. If you miss one day or you mess up one day, it's probably not a big deal. But yeah, if you compound this day after day after day, like he said, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then you span that over the course of an entire semester, you're missing huge amounts of time that could have been beneficial. One important point, just for the people who might listen to this, when we say protein synthesis, it's not necessarily a marker of hypertrophy. So people who are, I think, notoriously bodybuilders are super, I can't drink because it's going to blunt this protein synthesis. Protein synthesis is a muscle remodeling marker. So proteins turn over all the time. It doesn't mean it's necessarily getting bigger. Obviously, you have to synthesize protein to get bigger. But yeah, anytime we talk about protein synthesis, I just feel the need to talk about that. It gets bastardized quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. And that you made a good point there too of how it's kind of a compounding issue, and that's again just focusing on the protein synthetic response. Like there's also, the hormonal piece that comes into play, and then the sleep, and usually all of those together create an optimal environment for recovery. And so again, when you just kind of go down the line and you're hindering each one of those that normally would work in unison, you just kind of get magnifying reductions as you go across the board. So you might not absorb it as well, you might not sleep as well, you might not have the right hormonal response or profile that you normally would in that situation, which also can be worsened by poor sleep quality. Hydration status might be lower if you're kind of dehydrated through the night, if you didn't rehydrate along the way. That can also play a role in that process as well. So it's just kind of a perfect storm of what you wouldn't want, I guess, for optimal recovery following intense exercise or training. Not to say it completely abolishes it, but it just doesn't help. And if you're spending, all that time and effort, you just want to get bang for your buck. You want to get something out of it at the end. Otherwise, you're taking one step forward, two steps back, or just certainly not getting the most out of it. So it kind of depends on what your situation is as an athlete and what you have coming up. If that's the end of the season and you just won the championship, go hog wild. It's not really going to matter at that point. But if you play in a sport that does back-to-back games, or for you have maybe one day off in between and then you have another game, you probably want to think pretty hard about what you're doing after that first game. If you have another one 24, 48 hours right after that, in terms of I would hope that you'd want to do everything in your power to really kind of recover to the best of your ability, and alcohol really wouldn't be a good option in that type of scenario. So again, always coming back to context, it kind of matters where you are in the season and what is coming up in the near future for you.
I also want to make one more point because I kind of breezed over it, but I think something important, because just thinking back to all the times in athletics when buddies want to go out or whatever, some people, they try to kind of blunt the effects of drinking by, okay, if I'm going to go out and drink, I'm going to make sure I eat water, I'm going to eat enough protein, eat right. But I think an important finding that paper I was just talking about is if we even co-ingest alcohol with whey protein, which is not the most ideal source of protein in the world, but it's high in leucine content, it's rapidly digesting, it's a high quality protein food source. Even with co-ingestion of whey protein, we see a blunted protein synthetic response. So meaning that even if you check all the boxes that you normally would, even if you could theoretically sleep well, eat right, hydrate well, all these things, it would likely be still ineffective to completely block out the effects. But that said, they did show that co-ingestion with protein was better than co-ingestion with carbohydrate, meaning that if you can do all these things to check the boxes, you're likely handling some of that detriment, like taking some part of that detriment away. So that's something to think about if we're talking practically for, say, a Saturday night and we have practice on Monday. Make sure we're doing things right so we can be up and out and ready for Monday.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the sleep. I'm by no means an athlete, nor am I competing in any kind of regular athletic activity, but just looking at my own like sleep data, after maybe having, beers throughout the day, whatever it may be, but more spread out, eating in between. So you're never getting the onslaught of like the mass quantities. My sleep tends to do pretty good. Maybe my heart rate goes up a little bit, but not significantly. Now, if it was a late evening, even if it's just a later evening and a couple drinks and a condensed time, like on Thursday night, bro happy hour calls or something of that nature, it is almost like clockwork to wake up and look at my sleep data and my resting heart rate, having my resting heart rate go up by 8 to 10 beats per minute, at its lowest point, and my sleep quality to be much lower than it was, and to basically have my Oura ring tell me to just chill out that day because it doesn't think that I recovered at all. And so I know I had heard that with other people that, I've used tracking for it as well, and it's just kind of like, oh, how true is that? Fairly true, at least in my case.
Yeah.
Which was really interesting to see when it comes to that. And that's something I've tried to relay back to athletes is, again, like, you go and you play and you put your body through the hardest thing you're going to all week, especially if we get done at night. So not only are you revved up on caffeine and ibuprofen, you're now going to go and consume however many drinks, plus then try and get up the next day to get going with stuff. Like, it's just a terrible setup for recovery in order to get ready for that next week.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting that you brought up the, how you feel the next morning, because we've focused primarily on consuming alcohol after a game or something and how it can impact recovery moving forward. But it's also important to bring up, if you have an early morning workout and you're out partying the night before and think you're going to be able to get up and be able to train at 100% the next morning, like, that's also an important kind of time period to focus on. And you'll see a lot of the same things, but you're just going into that session already in a compromised state. So there, again, you're just not likely to get the same out of your training that you would have normally if you would have gotten the right sleep and wouldn't have done those things the night before. So again, whichever end of it you're on, still probably not the best or the day before strategy to go with, I guess.
So one, we were kind of talking about this off camera a little bit, and I actually just got done watching The Last Dance, which if you guys haven't seen, it's kind of interesting.
So good. Really good.
But you see in that, even, Michael Jordan after a game in a series, like, not the season isn't over yet, drinking Miller Lights or whatever it may be, or if it's not that he was drinking, guys smoking a cigar like in the hotel room, the night before a game, which everything tells you that you shouldn't be doing that. And so I know we were kind of talking about that, we aren't necessarily going all the way to one spectrum where we're saying, no, never, not do it, because that could obviously be somewhat hypocritical, but also just, there's people that do that. But I was just thinking about this the other day is, when you look at probably most of the people that we're going to reach with this aren't the elite top tier 1% of athletes where they're so good at what they do that they can probably take a little bit of negative effects, if that's, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, in terms of having a couple beers or, having a cigar. I don't know that he was fully inhaling everything and, really compromising his lungs by any means, but that compared to someone that's trying to get the most that they can out of everything they can, because any big uptick, it could mean a huge difference for them. It's looking at a small percentage increase that can mean all the world to the best, or because they're so good, it doesn't make a difference, versus a huge upstart for someone that's a Division III college athlete or something like that. So long story short, like we were talking before, like I've heard elite level athletes that have had a beer the night before a race because it helps calm the nerves. It helps bring them down just a little bit, and they go from there. My guess is if you remove the alcohol from that beer and they didn't know about it, they probably would have treated them exactly the same. So any just kind of thoughts around general use, or if there is a good, in quotes, amount or safe amount or anything like that we haven't already covered?
I think athletes tend to, just anecdotally, because I don't think that's a great question to be answered by science. I think anecdotally, athletes who have a vast array of competition experience tend to have an opportunity to figure that out for themselves at some point. So if you generally, if you talk to a newbie within their first couple competitions, they either are so nervous leading in that they don't want to do anything wrong, or they don't care enough yet and they just don't know what competing well feels like. So I think, speaking from my experience, I had a pretty good idea of what I could and couldn't do the night before. And I, to be fair and completely transparent, had quite a bit more of an upper limit on nights before than a lot of other people did. As long as I kept the water flowing and the activity as down as I could, not walking around too much, not jumping around like an idiot, I could have 4 or 5 drinks and not even miss a beat in the morning, and have had more than that. I think it's all about priorities, which is kind of a cop out for that question. But it's an important aspect of, okay, we're talking about, like you said, somebody who's bumping and grinding, trying to make it to the next level, maybe on the fringe of a draft, or on the fringe of being recruited by a Division I, something like that. The answer is, do you value that night of drinking more than you value that night of recovery or the 2 days of recovery? If you don't, then you should probably just skip it altogether. But if you do value that night, you just got to take some precautions to try to mitigate as much of that deleterious effect as you can, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to approach it. And, if that athlete knows that they're not going on to the next professional level and this is the only time they're going to get to celebrate with their teammates, and I don't think there's anything wrong with going out and having a little too much fun throughout the season, as much as coaches probably don't want to hear that. But I think a lot of them are also realistic about it too, at least ones that I've worked with, even at EWL. They kind of understand that the players are going to do what they're going to do, and I think a lot of their message is usually try to be safe and try to do a lot of those little things, and I think that's a good way to approach it. And there's still probably athletes that don't partake in those things because they maybe do prioritize their season or whatever their goals are ahead of that. And there's no right or wrong way. It all depends on that particular person. And same thing with their degree of tolerability. I think everyone's probably figured out the hard way of what their upper limit is, of what they can get away with the next day. I remember tons of times of playing baseball in the summer and just regretting all of my life choices the night before, as you're sweating out in the heat and you can just smell the beer in your helmet, and it's just man, that was a bad idea. definitely had too many, and so hopefully you just learn from those and figure out what works best for you. And I think, if we really get nitpicky about it too, not only is the amount, but I think, at least for me, the type of alcohol that you're ingesting plays a big role too, of whether it's, if it's light beer, like, I don't want to brag, but it's like, that really doesn't impact me at all. I can have a pretty good amount of those and still wake up and feel okay. But if you're drinking, IPAs all night, yeah, you're going to wake up with a headache. Or if you're doing like kamikaze shots and sugary alcohol with, a ton of caffeine and mixers and all that, you're going to wake up feeling a lot different than you would if you had other types of drinks. So again, science really hasn't teased that out, and I don't think they ever will. That's not really the kind of question that you see answered there. But from a practical standpoint, I'm sure everyone knows how their body responds to those different types of drinks. So that's also important to consider too, of really what are you drinking, in addition to how much of it.
I also think that's a good point. If we're talking about beers, that's one thing, but if we're talking about liquor, I think something that people don't really think about in the moment is like, what are you mixing with? So if you're like vodka soda, okay, but then you get into like rum and coke, whiskey coke, it's like, all right, it's a lot of sugar. Are you going to be able to handle that in the morning in your gut? And the worst is always like waking up after vodka Red Bulls or something like that.
Right, where you're combining the two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Not only do you have the alcohol that's going to affect your sleep, but then you're slamming back 600 to 800 milligrams of caffeine that you don't really ever feel because you're also mixing it with a ton of vodka. I think my MO when I was competing a lot was like just whiskey water or vodka water. That was a good way for me to balance. Or I've done like vodka Gatorades or vodka Pedialytes. But definitely, yeah, I've had plenty of experiences where you don't really think about what you're mixing with, and that just comes back and bites you in the ass real hard.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else specific we wanted to cover with this?
I think it'd be interesting to hear from you guys, your experience with what do you think? I know you have a couple, Joel, that I don't remember per se, but your kind of way you go about mitigating the next morning effects, like how you prepare for an event of drinking. Everyone has their own little ways, and I think it'd just be interesting to chat about that for a second.
For me, it's really focusing on the hydration part of it. I get into trouble in that I really enjoy the taste of beer. It's something I enjoy a lot. I enjoy the act of having like a bourbon. I've made the argument, and I saw something pop up the other day, and I wanted to buy it just to try it, where it was supposed to be like alcoholic bourbon. Yeah. And I just was curious as to the taste, because sometimes it is just that. It's the act of having a small pour, and whether you're reading or just hanging out, like it's just being able to sip on something and enjoying that. It's not necessarily the process of drinking to inebriate yourself. But anyway, I tend to start drinking those things because they taste good, and I drink it like I'm just thirsty, and that can be troubling for me because that catches up quickly. So it's really, for me, focusing on the hydration. And I'm one of those that I get hungry when I drink for the most part. So usually the food consumption is not a big deal on my end. I'll do that, but in kind of agreement with AJ, like if I know that it might be a longer night, I would start out with a beer or two that I want to enjoy the flavor of, an IPA or something along those lines. But then we'll switch to the light beer because my body processes it so much better. Not only from the alcohol standpoint, but I think the IPAs really mess with me in other ways.
Yeah.
As it comes from. I've heard from other people, and I've never bit the bullet in terms of buying it, but like trying to load up on like glutathione as a amino acid to help mitigate it. In theory, the best way to do it is doing something that is dissolvable, like on your tongue. In terms of getting it into your system, it doesn't do so well if you just take capsule form. but in theory, it just boosts that up to help your body process the alcohol through your liver so that you don't feel the effects as hard. And then I don't do a good job of this, or I didn't do a good job of this, and always have tried to do more, is I need to stay awake a while before I go to bed. That's one that I struggle with because I'm not a late night person anyway. But drinking water, staying up for a little while, just letting my body chill, then helps seemingly me sleep better on the back end, which is kind of my few things to take away that I've found. And again, it's just keeping it mindful. That's one question I want to ask you guys, and maybe we can put this all into one thing, is, kind of like your one takeaway that you would recommend, from this episode of, around alcohol and athletes. And I just come back to me and working with our college athletes. Obviously, I'd prefer them all to be 21 when they went out drinking, knowing that's not always feasible in terms of my wants for them in college. But, there really is a difference between going out and having a good time and having a six-pack and not trying to go through an entire case in a night, or, all the different random shots that, keeping it in context, because if you want to win and you want to succeed at this level, like, you need every advantage you can get. And so don't be upset that if you're not performing well yet after, and you happen to lose and you go out and you get blasted and you come back and you don't feel like yourself till Tuesday. Don't be surprised when that doesn't work out as well as you had hoped. And there's things you can control. And to me, that's one of them. Not removing your fun from being a college student, but that's something that's easily within your control. And I think those are the factors we have to take a look at.
Yeah, especially when that, if you really have a good time and that extends into the next day, and you have one of those Saturdays where you're so hungover, you can't even get off the couch till like 3. So you're also not really eating, you're not really drinking, you're not really doing anything that Saturday. It's like now you've missed another day where you could have been just getting better as an athlete, to kind of describe it broadly, right? But you're probably, again, not eating enough overall calories, probably not getting enough protein, carbohydrates, fat, vitamins, minerals, just go down the list. If all you can stomach that day was like buttered toast and some water and rice, because you're nauseous and just literally can't move. And everyone's probably been there. But again, just think of if that's in season for you, and if you have another game a couple days away, or you got workouts Saturday night, Sunday, or whatever day of the week we're in, again, you're just not doing yourself any favors there. One thing that may or may not help, depending on the intensity of it, is, I remember being in college when people would say, I got to go work off that booze, and you'd head over to the rec center or whatever and just hop on an elliptical and try to, burn off all the booze calories that you just consumed, from more of like a kind of energy flux standpoint. But light exercise will kind of help at least make you feel a little bit better if you can. Not to say you should go out and do, high intensity interval sprints. I would stay away from really intense workouts if you're really, I guess, hungover or hurting or didn't sleep much the night before. Not really. You're going to, again, see probably compromised responses to that training session. But light activity will definitely help, I think, get you back to normal a little bit. So just another thing to consider as we get into the next day type of scenario.
For me, it's always mowing the lawn hungover is perfect. I got a big enough yard that it's like 30, 45 minutes of walking around in the sun, and you just kind of sweat off and feel a little bit better.
Yeah. For me, a jet ski ride, if I was at the lake, waking up, hopping on a jet ski in the morning was the best thing to snap me back to real life. Not always feasible, but
so kind of ultimately, in summary, and feel free to jump in on this, kind of what I got is it's a risk versus reward type of relationship. Like, if you're going to do it, it's not necessarily going to be the end of what you're trying to accomplish as an athlete, but you got to understand some of the risks that come with it, that it could decrease your performance. It can help in the process of not recovering, potentially not getting all your training adaptations. and all the things that we've talked about. And that's really got to be up to the decision of the athlete of, you know, for lack of a better description, priorities in terms of what's going to make the difference.
Yeah, and I would add too, like if it's possible, try to do, you know, as we mentioned earlier, kind of checking those boxes. The sooner you can do that before you start drinking, the more it will help. So if you get done training, again, going back to like a Friday example, if you get done at 4, shower, try to get a good meal at like 5 or 6, you know, maybe 2 hours before you start your pre-gaming and wander downtown. So give yourself some time in there where you can digest and absorb some of that food and, you know, kind of start that recovery process, even though you may be somewhat hindering it later as the night comes. But again, I think even that will make a big difference as opposed to going right from that 4 o'clock lift or whatever, bam, you're going to start at happy hour and just start getting after it right away. Like that definitely wouldn't be the best way to kind of approach that from a timeline standpoint. And then, you know, kind of like you said earlier, maybe trying to shut it down, at least stop drinking around midnight, you know, depending on how late you're going to be out. And then maybe from midnight to 1, you're just drinking waters and kind of winding the night down and then trying to be in bed at 2-ish. I don't know. I mean, every college kid's different. I remember being out well past that, but
the John Tapper 1 for 1 infomercial, if you're watching Bar Rescue, 1 drink for 1 glass of water.
Well, I think that brings up my big take home point would be being somebody who's a little bit more rough around the edges as far as drinking habits in this call. The biggest thing that's the most diplomatic way I could come up to say it. But the biggest thing, even I developed it when I was training hard because I liked to go out and have times with my friends, drink a little bit too much, as AJ says, have a little bit too much fun. But I also was pretty serious about my training. Luckily, I don't know what in me, but I handle alcohol pretty well the next day as long as I plan for it. So I think it's pretty rare that you get surprised into a big night of drinking. My biggest thing is always, like, if I know I'm going to, go out and have too many drinks that night, gallons of water all day, probably some Pedialyte, get home, make sure I'll usually have half a gallon sitting out waiting when I get home, make sure I get that down before I go to bed. Every time I wake up to go to the bathroom, chug a glass of water, and then it's right away hitting water and food in the morning, just trying to build everything back up. The worst days I ever have are when you don't really think about it. You wake up feeling hungover, you don't eat, you just sip on water, and then you feel like crap all day. If you can plan right, you're probably not going to feel nearly as bad in the morning. And then also, if you can just get after water and food, try to take a nap. Now that you're not just dying from alcohol being in your system, all these things were huge for me when I was training at our level.
People would make fun of me when I would do that sometimes. Like as I kind of matured in my drinking habits, I would do a lot of those same things, like kind of preparing to go out or preparing for the next morning already. Yeah, and people would be, can't you just relax and just drink and have fun? It's like, well, yeah, but I was kind of like you. Like I knew kind of how to go about it the right way, I guess, to set myself up for not a complete disaster the next day.
Trying to make it suck less.
Yeah, especially if you were going to do it all over again the next day. I mean, we've all had those weekends where you know it's going to be a couple of hard nights or whatever you're doing for a couple days in a row. Like, you know, I would always laugh at my buddies that couldn't get out of bed till noon the next day when I had already been up for several hours and already felt pretty good. And I could start getting after it again the next day if I wanted to. But, you know, so it all just kind of, again, depends on your situation, what you got to do. And yeah, that's a great idea. The more you can be prepared for it, I think the better you're going to be able to take it in stride.
Even if it's not a physiological change, I think it's just like, even if you wake up on Monday, say you partied Saturday, you wake up Sunday hungover, even if you wake up Monday feeling fine, there's been so many examples of like, if you laid around feeling like shit all day, the day before, you kind of still kind of feel like crap. But if you were up and at them, you kind of forget about it. You're feeling good. You're like, all right, productive. Then you come into Monday just ready for the week, ready for training, ready for practice, game, whatever it might be. I feel like, the minimizing the time that you're being torn down from the inside out, I think is super helpful.
Yeah. And you can always just start having kids, because once you're hungover with little kids in the picture, you'll never want to do that again. So that's a quick deterrent for any of those kinds of activities.
Or be a PhD or master's student.
Yeah. That's probably what got you into the habit in the first place.
Yeah, I think it was that first time I walked in the lab with Jason.
Oh, man. I'll never forget NSCA New Orleans, the way I saw you the next morning.
Oh, yeah. I wish
anything else for this episode, and then we can relive some of these things off air when it comes to the podcast.
What's your best hangover remedy the next morning? What's your best drink or go-to breakfast food?
Gallon of Pedialyte with 3 sticks, or gallon of water with 3 sticks of Pedialyte. Finish that within like an hour and 15 minutes, and then have like a big breakfast, eggs, hash browns, whatever. But just a big meal and a lot of electrolytes and water. Even if you just piss away a lot of the electrolytes, I think it's easier to drink because it's a little bit sweet. And then some of the electrolytes, obviously, you're sweating all night, whatever. I think it helps a ton.
Me is just finding something of fluids that I'm willing to put down for whatever reason. Sometimes water doesn't always seem good, so sometimes it's carbonated water, or coffee might sound good on any given day. Different things there, and then getting some food in me. I know people say sometimes greasy food is what it is, but just a decent breakfast with something, potatoes and whatnot in it, seems to do the trick.
Yeah, I always liked a good breakfast in the morning too. And then my go-to drink is Monsters Rehabs. Always snap me back into life.
Oh,
it's my go-to drink.
The Blue Monsters.
Well, I think that's about all we have to cover before we keep diving into wormholes that come up around this topic.
We don't want to record the rest of these conversations.
Right. So with that, we'll have this. AJ, I think you said you had some resources maybe that you had come across, infographics or whatnot.
Yep, I got a couple good ones, and then I found that paper too that Andy was referencing that we can share with us. It's a good one.
Only if I was
those up when we publish this out, so we can.
You're pretty good. They did give 12 drinks is the amount that they provided, so that's a pretty good pop to provide subjects.
But we will link all that up in the show notes when we get this episode released, so you can be looking for that and some extra information there. And until next time, thanks for listening.
All right. Cheers.